thanks for joining us in this week's episode of the podcast. My guest is Amanda Knox, joining us all the way from Seattle. Thanks for coming on, Amanda.
Well, thank you for having me.
How's things with yourself? How's things over in America at the moment? Obviously, we're in Scotland and it's very much in lockdown and we're stuck inside, so it's a challenging time for many. But how are things where you are?
Yeah, it's similar. It's interesting that, it's kind of that way for everyone, right? The kind of joke around here is, well, if you don't like quarantine, go to Georgia. They just don't do it. So there's a lot of division in the United States around how much we all need to be protecting ourselves. Here in Washington State, we're taking it very seriously. In Seattle, we have this 4-step plan for reopening the city and King County in general. But we're all at home, and I've never lived through something like this where, I have to stay 6 feet away from my grandmother because she's, doing chemotherapy, and she recently went in for heart surgery. So there are particularly vulnerable people that we're all close to, that we can't physically be close to. And in that way, it's very similar to prison. And in other ways, it's not. In very big ways, it's not. It's obviously a big burden on everyone. I think a huge emotional burden for everyone. The uncertainty of the future is challenging for everyone. So I'm feeling that. Everyone I know is feeling that. I'm sure you're feeling that.
Of course.
And I guess we're the one sort of upshot to all of this is we're all in it together. So no one's alone and feeling alone.
And it almost seems like there isn't light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll get there. So, just for those that are listening, Amanda, I'd imagine 90% of people that are tuning into this have heard of yourself and your story. But just to give people a bit of background about you, who you are, what you're doing just now, and what brought you to where you are.
Yeah. So today I am a journalist and criminal justice advocate. I spend most of my time writing, researching, and interviewing people about either their experiences going through the criminal justice system or people who are working within the system to change it. And this is not something that I was always meant to do. I was never a true crime person growing up. I was a poetry and Harry Potter person. So prison and the criminal justice system was the farthest thing from my mind. I never really had any experience with it. I just assumed that bad people commit crimes and bad people go to prison, and I hopefully would never have to encounter any of that in my life. And then when I was 20, I went to study abroad in Perugia, Italy. And shortly after I arrived, one of my roommates was murdered. I was living in a cottage in Perugia near the university with 3 other students, one of whom was British. And it just so happened that the night of the break-in, she was alone. This person broke into our home. I don't know if he broke in before she came home from her friend's house or if she was already home when he arrived. Either way, what resulted is her rape and murder. And shortly after all of this was discovered, I was arrested. I was put through 53 hours of interrogation over 5 days. I was singled out. There's a lot of debate about why I was singled out. A lot of people have a lot of different theories. Some people talk about whether or not I acted appropriately around the crime scene. A lot of people talk about, I mean, a lot of it has to do with just how people thought I was responding emotionally to the situation. And unfortunately, that led to tunnel vision by the investigators and prosecutors, and they sort of put their foot down on any kind of theory that involved me in the crime, despite the fact that no physical evidence placed me there. I had an alibi. I have no history of, criminal behavior or anything like that. I had no reason to hurt my friend. And they had evidence that someone else committed the crime, and yet they sort of went after me. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the case became an international sensation very quickly. And so there was a lot of public response and pressure on the investigators to solve the case very quickly. And then once they had solved the case and were wrong, they sort of had a choice: either admit that they were wrong and embarrass themselves in front of the world, or dig in their heels and say that they were right all along. And they chose that second path, which isn't uncommon. Anyway, what all of that whole experience of being tried and imprisoned for years for a crime that I didn't commit, it really exposed me to the criminal justice system. It exposed me to the reality of prison and what kinds of people are living there and barely surviving there. It helped me realize how flippant and casually cruel and dehumanizing both the court of public opinion and the criminal justice system can be. And it kind of became my lifelong mission to try to fix that. I mean, I don't personally feel like I alone am ever going to make a tremendous change just by myself. It's a whole human effort. All of us need to care about it. But ever since I've been exposed to this reality, I can't stop thinking about it. A lot of my heroes in this world talk about becoming proximate to the injustice that you see in the world. And, I didn't mean to become proximate to this injustice. It was not on my radar. I was shoved into the proximity and, in fact, the eye of the storm of this injustice. And now that I am proximate, I'm staying there because I can't look away.
Sure. And you mentioned, you were 20 years old when you first went to Italy, and I'd imagine when you're sitting on that plane on the way there, you've got hopes and dreams of it being a fantastic trip in a wonderful country, and your whole future ahead of you. It seems that all very quickly that was soon taken away from you.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot was taken from me. It should be said that the most that was taken was from Meredith, my roommate. I mean, she was only 21, and she also, just like me, traveled to Italy to study abroad, dream trip, new culture, new people. And the thing that haunts me to this day is if I had been home that night, I could be dead. So there are tragedies upon tragedies that resulted from this crime. And yeah, I mean, just not too long ago when people were doing the sort of hashtag me at 20 meme thing where they are on Instagram or on Twitter.
And I've noticed that you put one on if you're sitting on the plane when you were on your way.
Yeah. I did, because 20 is a special year for me, a special year, it's the year that I lost everything, and there was no guarantee that I would get it back. And, a year ago, just a year ago, my youngest sister turned 20. I'm 33 now, and so I'm 12 years older than my youngest sister. She was very small when I first went in, and she didn't really fully understand what was happening to me at the time. But when she turned 20, I couldn't help myself. I was like, so if you were me, you'd be going to prison now. And she was just like, because, 20 sounds like a big number when you're an 8-year-old. But when you're 20, you're still a kid, or at least I was, because I had grown up in such a sheltered, loving, protected environment. Like I never, when I was in prison, a lot of crazy things go in your mind when you try to ask yourself why. Like, why is this happening to me? I asked myself that a lot at the time, and continue to do so to this day. But inside, a part of me wondered crazily if I had had such a good childhood that, fate was finally catching up with me and being like, oh, wait, weren't you supposed to suffer a little bit? We'll just give you a lot of extra suffering to make up for the fact that you've never suffered. And as crazy as that sounds, like, you're in a situation where the existential crisis is so great that you're trying to seek any answer to explain why this is happening to you when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I would like to touch on that time if it's okay with yourself. Obviously, you says that you were 20 and all those things happened, and you mentioned yourself there. You were a child, and that's 13 years on from then. I'm sure that many things have changed from then, and certainly you might have dealt with things differently if you're now in a different headspace. But when you return to where you're staying in Perugia at that time, and you discover what's essentially behind that door in the flat, what starts going through your head at that time? What are you thinking?
The first thing that I thought when I came home was that someone must have accidentally left the door open. The front door of our cottage wouldn't stay closed unless you locked the door. And I figured someone might have left really quickly and just didn't fully lock the door. So, I think, like, as I progressively discovered more and more things out of place or wrong in the cottage, I kept trying to think of why that might be. And I kept thinking of the familiar, right? Like, okay, the front door is open. Maybe someone just forgot to close the door. Okay. I took a shower and then I noticed that there was blood on the floor, and I thought, oh, wow, that's unusual. Maybe someone had their period or cut themselves. Like, all of these things went through my mind where I was trying to find a reasonable, rational reason why these things were happening. It didn't immediately occur to me, of course, my roommate's been murdered. Like, that was so,
It's the last thing on your mind,
yeah.
I suppose, isn't it?
I
It's the
mean,
last thing you're thinking.
like, my mind rebelled against the idea that something like that, something as serious as that, could have happened. And I mean, the one, special grace out of all of this was I never actually saw her body. We had already called the cops by then, and so they, alongside one of my roommate's friends, broke down the door to Meredith's room and found her body there. And I fortunately did not see it. But the gravity of the situation really hit me in waves, and it took longer to hit me than you would think, because I just had no experience with this. It was not something that I was prepared to process. And so, step by step, I had tremendous emotional waves of, like, sadness and grief and fear and confusion and numbness and disbelief. And so I kept cycling through these various emotions in response to discovering, like, oh, the door's open. Oh my gosh, there's a break-in. Oh my gosh, Meredith's missing. Oh my gosh, she's dead. Like, everything took me a while to process. And I mean, even, as I was being interrogated, I didn't understand why I was being interrogated. they had handcuffs on me, and I still assumed, because they told me, that I was a witness, that I wasn't a suspect. And it wasn't until I had already been in prison for, a day or two, that I was brought before a judge and finally told, Amanda Knox, you are under investigation for the murder of Meredith Kircher. Like, someone had to literally spell it out to me for me to realize and understand that that was what was happening to me. So I
And
think,
it took a while, Amanda, obviously, like you said, to sink in. And at first, you were essentially assisting the police with their investigation. And obviously, in America, for example, that would be a challenge. But in a foreign country, I can imagine that was even more difficult. And you're speaking a second language. And then very, very quickly, it turned to the attention was on yourself and your boyfriend, Raffaele. And again, that you mentioned earlier on, maybe the way that you were acting was reasons why they thought that you were a suspect. And do you see where that's coming from? Would you agree with why they would think that, or do you disagree with?
um, what I think is that, on the one hand, yes, I was the odd person out, right? Like, I was the one person in that whole scenario who didn't know how to dial 911 in Italy. Like, I didn't know how to do that. I had to have my boyfriend do it. I was the one who couldn't fully communicate and understand what the police were telling me to do. I was the one who had no, I was the one who was farthest away from my family and my culture and everything that I knew and loved. So, in that way, I was certainly the odd one out. Um, but on the other hand, like, there's a thing that researchers, or a friend of mine who's a researcher who became a friend of mine after everything, have called the Filomena Effect, which is actually named after one of my roommates. And that is, once someone is accused or once someone is suspected of something horrible, suddenly people rethink their perceptions of that person. So, in the days leading up to my arrest, while I was being interrogated, I still had a relationship with my other roommates, and we were talking about getting together and getting another apartment together and meeting with Meredith's family. And, you know, nothing had changed between us. It was only once I was arrested and accused that suddenly people who had met me started rethinking about me in terms of suspicious terms. So I think that the investigators didn't know me. They had no reason to suspect me or not suspect me, in the sense that they, didn't have interactions with me before all of this. I do think that they were exposed to me more than other people because I exposed myself to them. I made myself available to them. I was very, very, I mean, helpful. I showed up when they called. And I gave them every bit of information I could. I think I must have spent more time in that police office than anyone, because Raffaele and I was the one who came home that morning. I was the first person to sort of stumble upon this crime scene after it had occurred. And I think for that reason, they really honed in on me. And then once they got a vibe, they decided to really hammer home on that vibe. One thing, though, that I really try to emphasize, and a constant frustration that I have when people ask me about my behavior in those days, is it does feel like people are trying to find fault with me for my own wrongful conviction. And one thing that I really like to point out to people is the person with the least amount of power in that situation was me. The investigators had a lot more power than I did. The prosecutor had a lot more power than I did. Their decisions led to my wrongful conviction, not mine. I think that, a lot of people ask me if I would have done things differently. And, I'm a 33-year-old woman now. I was a 20-year-old kid then. Of course, I would react differently now. But I was a kid and I was trying to help. And I do not fault my 20-year-old self for what happened to her. She didn't deserve that.
If we take it in custody, and again, I'll hark back to, at this point, I believe that your mother came over to visit you as well, and as you mentioned, there was hours and hours and hours of interrogation, and many things of what you say could potentially have been translated wrong, picked up wrong. There could have been double meanings there as well. At that point, did you feel that you were being treated unfairly by the prosecution or by the police, or did you, because you were young and maybe a bit naive and had never experienced that before, did you think this is just what it's like when you're arrested? Or?
I mean, again, I didn't even realize that I was being arrested. So I was so naive that I didn't it didn't compute that as they were, strip searching me and, taking photographs of my naked body and putting handcuffs on me, that this wasn't a part of being a witness to a very, very serious case. I put myself at the mercy of the police officers because I needed to trust them in that very, very scary, drastic situation. I needed them to guide me, and they guided me into a trap.
And I know there's been plenty documented, about that interrogation. And I remember watching a documentary on Netflix as well, which I know that you're part of. And I can't remember the police chief's name, but this certainly local police chief, and he mentions, there was part of that interrogation where you just almost snapped, and you could feel yourself screaming and getting very frustrated. And what would you put that down to? Do you think that's just overarching pressure on yourself, and maybe actually coming to the realization that something is serious here?
I mean, I understood that the situation was serious the entire time, right? Even if it took me a long time for the gravity of the situation to sink in, I was not confused about how important it was that I do everything I could to help the police. I knew that was the right thing to do. What became incredibly difficult and what ultimately broke me was discovering that no matter how much I was honest and no matter how much I repeated myself and no matter how many times I sat through the same questions over and over and over again, the police weren't happy with me. They were angry with me. In fact, they kept getting angrier and angrier. And they got so angry that they slapped me. That was the scariest moment of my life, was not understanding why I was being put through that. And again, you're in a scary, drastic existential crisis situation, and you try desperately to figure out why. And the only thing that I could think of, and in fact, I didn't even think it, the police told me this, was that I must have amnesia and that I must not remember correctly, and that actually I must have witnessed the murder. And if I don't admit to that now, then I'm a liar. And I mean, going through this process of knowing that I didn't remember, I did not witness this crime, but they're telling me I did. I could not understand why they were hurting me.
Do you almost start to doubt yourself when you're in that situation?
Absolutely. I was made to doubt myself, and I was made to believe that something else was true. And this is, I thought for the longest time that this was something that only happened to me and that I was a particularly broken person. But since coming home, I've come into contact with lots of people who have been put through that situation. And a lot of the work that I do now is trying to bring attention to, interrogation techniques that break down anyone's ability to rationalize and stay sane in that situation. It's great at breaking down guilty people and great at breaking down innocent people. And that's the problem. So, it's these kinds of things that I didn't know about as a kid that I now am trying to bring attention to, because I know this is not, we don't go to school and hear about what your rights are. We don't go to school and hear about how police can lie to your face. We don't, like these are all things that we never even think we're going to need to know. And of course, what happened to me is a very exceptional and rare thing, but it's not an exceptional and rare thing when it happens to a poor Black kid. So like, these are all things that we need to be aware of. And I mean, in my opinion, care about. So that's, anyway.
And I would imagine, in the line of work that you're doing now, you would often see, and through your own experience as well, how much the role of the media can have on a trial, or on certainly painting a picture of someone that's innocent or guilty. And that was something, I suppose, that played a big part in your trial. And was that something, I don't know when you realised, maybe when your mother first came over, the extent of, this is a global news story?
I mean, I didn't fully realize how big of a story it was until I came home, because, Italian prison, you don't get access to international media. I just knew that every time I went into the courtroom, I was blinded by camera flashes. I knew that people who were sort of mythological figures, the Hillary Clintons in the world, the Donald Trumps of the world, were commenting on my case.
It's interesting you mention that, because I'm sure Donald Trump at one point was asking people to boycott Italy as well. Is that correct?
He did do that. Yes, he did. I mean, I think the thing that...
And just to be clear, this was well before he was the president of the United States.
Indeed, yes. In fact, I think he was calling for the president to intervene. And of course, that's a very... it's criminal justice systems and international law are a lot more complicated than that. As much as I would have loved it if a, SWAT team just, took a helicopter in and scooped me up, like I knew that wasn't going to happen. Yeah, so to this day, I'm amazed at how many people are impacted by the criminal justice system. And, the media is a tool, right? Like, you're a media person, I'm a media person. I have a podcast. I've done the Scarlet Letter reports. My podcast is called The Truth About True Crime. These are all ways of engaging with this topic in the media. And the media is not good or bad. What it is it conveys information, and that it's the quality of the information and the way that it is presented that will achieve an outcome. And unfortunately, in my case, much of the media attention was very sensational. Its outcome was the goal outcome was to make money. It was not to, shed light on a situation. It wasn't to, challenge people's assumptions. It was about making money and exploiting people's assumptions and exploiting people's fantasies and fears about young women who are associated with crime.
And some of the
And
headlines, Amanda, were really sensational. There was lots of things about sex games gone wild, and there was no real, in my gathering, there was no real evidence to suggest that was anywhere near the case. It was almost, what is going to sell more newspapers here, rather than getting down to the bottom line of what actually happened on the evening and who was involved.
so to be fair to the tabloid journalists who really ran with that, they didn't invent it out of whole cloth, right? The investigators and prosecutors were trying to understand how, or were theorizing, trying to come up with a theory to explain how my roommate could get raped and murdered by me, right?
Okay.
And clearly I'm not raping my friend. So they came up with this theory of some kind of drug-fueled sex game. And they put me as the sort of dominatrix figurehead of that sex game because that was the only way that they could concoct a theory that would explain how Meredith was raped and murdered, if I was involved. But again, that's like coming from, we know that my roommate was raped and murdered. You don't have to construe an extra like fantasy crime on top of that just because you want to fit someone who doesn't fit into that scenario in there, right? Like there was a lot of just extraness to this case. Unfortunately, this case was actually very simple, and it blew up into this complicated thing because people kept adding ideas and stories on top of that because none of the parts fit. They were trying to stick a square peg into a round hole, and they couldn't do it, so they just invented whole new ideas and tried to shove things into it. And again, like, unfortunately, that's the case in a lot of wrongful convictions cases. I've heard stories where like they finally test the DNA from a rape kit from 20 years ago, and it's not the DNA of the person they put in prison for the rape, and they say, oh well, actually that 6-year-old must have had sex with someone earlier that day, and that's that person's semen. And then this guy the 6-year-old had consensual sex with someone earlier, and then later she got raped by this other guy, and that's why we didn't find his semen, we found this other guy's semen. It's insane the number of ways that people will find reason to be right all along, even when the evidence is staring at them in the face. And I think that's, a very human and understandable impulse, but it's got to be tempered by accountability. So, yeah.
And let's talk slightly about obviously when the conviction came through and your sentence, to 26 years, because from this point up until now, I would say, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but from the outside looking in, I would imagine those 4 years in a foreign prison have really shaped who you are just now. And as you touched on at the start, have really driven you on to do what you're doing in your career. What was, firstly, what was it like when you first got convicted? When you realised it was 26 years, and I can imagine it was a whirl of emotions, but what was initially going through your head?
So I was in prison for 2 years leading up to my conviction.
And why did that take so long, Amanda? Why was it?
Because it was allowed to take so long. Because
I'm guessing that's not standard.
I mean, I was shocked. I remember the day when they showed up with paperwork that said that they were allowed to hold me for up to a year with no charge.
Okay.
And I was shocked that a year of my life meant nothing to them. And then a trial that lasted almost a year because we were having, court dates a couple of times a week and just a million experts and a million witnesses. And again, blowing up a not complicated case into something incredibly complicated. leading up to the conviction, I was convinced that when the verdict was handed down, I was going to go home. I was convinced. I was sure. No matter all of the bad stuff that was being said about me in the media and the horrible stuff that was being said about me in the courtroom, once again, I was naive and I truly felt that the truth mattered, and that the truth would be the thing that came through in the end, the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing.
And in the lead up to that as well, I mean, were you getting pressed each day by people from the police or the investigators? Were they coming in and trying to get more from you, or was it just a case of it's 2 years to the trial, you're in there, sit and wait?
So the police were pushing. I was in prison for 8 months while they were investigating. And so I was continued to be pressured in the early months of my imprisonment, not necessarily by police investigators who were coming inside, but by prison officials who were then reporting to police. So, yes, I was going through a lot for a long time. And then when the reality struck that the truth didn't matter, and that the story was what mattered, I had a reckoning. I realized that my life, fairness wasn't a part of my life, and that I was just one of those people that suffer. I really had that moment of thinking, oh, I my life is suffering. It's not, working hard, and it's not falling in love, and it's not having babies. It's suffering.
And your family were there as well on the day, weren't they? And I'd imagine in their minds they also thought you were coming home, so that must make it 100 times harder for everyone involved.
Yeah. I mean, I was very, very lucky, and I've always been very, very lucky to have a very close and supportive family. And so they were all there. They were all there and ready to take me home. And the first visitation that I had afterwards, my little sisters were there. I didn't get to see them very often because they were in school, and it was hard, especially the young ones, to come into the prison to see me. And it was breathtakingly bizarre to sit in front of them with a 26-year sentence between me and them. And little Delaney telling me it was going to be okay. My youngest sister. It's funny. In a lot of ways, a lot of this feels very far away. Even when I'm doing my work, even when I'm deep diving into cases, because my life is so
every day
different
it's
now.
in the back of your mind every single day, even though it seems far away, it's always present as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's just there was never any guarantee that I would be freed. I mean, a lot of wrongfully convicted people have this sense that, the truth is gonna come through, and it may take a long time, but it's gonna come through. And I intuitively understood that there was no guarantee of that. As soon as I was convicted, I understood that there was no guarantee that the right thing was going to happen. And the fact that I'm out here today and I can do the work that I do is a tremendous blessing, and something that I do not take for granted, because of what could have been. Like, I'm sitting here in front of you today and I could be dead. I could be in prison. Those were realities that I escaped by the skin of my teeth. And really not through anything that I did, right? Like, I just happened to not be home that night. I was at my boyfriend's. I just happened to be the roommate that the prosecutors and investigators, narrowed in on. And then I just happened to, finally get a judge who would allow an independent expert to speak to the forensic evidence. Like, all of those things couldn't have happened. And I would be a different person today if they hadn't. I don't know. Do you have something like that in your life?
No, I don't think so. Not present.
Really? Come on. A
No,
life-changing thing?
I don't think so yet. No, not as of yet. Don't get me wrong. There's lots of times that you look back on and you think, would I have done that differently, or I wish that hadn't happened. And there's things that keep me smiling. But no, not as of yet. I don't think I've had that light bulb moment or that life changing moment yet. I wouldn't say so. But I suppose in your line of work at the moment, Amanda, you must see people who are going through hell similar to what you were going through yourself. And this could be a very, very silly question, but was there any point back then that there was a good day when you were in prison, that you could say to people just now, as much as this might feel like the worst thing in the world, there might be times in there where you can have hope, and you know that there might be light at the end of the tunnel?
Okay. This is a complicated question that requires a slightly complicated answer that I'm going to try to condense down as much as possible.
Sure.
I can affirm that there is no good day in prison. What I can also affirm, however, is that you can always find meaning and purposefulness even in the worst situations. And, that's kind of a great thing to remember in these times, when we're all struggling and we're all uncertain. You don't need certainty in your life, and you don't need to be free of struggle and free of pain in your life to do something meaningful and to feel like your life is worth it. So, one of the interesting, bittersweet things about being imprisoned for a long period of time is you're in a world that doesn't value you, and you have to make your own value for yourself in spite of everything. And to do that, you discover things about yourself. I discovered a lot about myself, and what I was capable of by being put through that experience. That isn't to say that I wish that experience upon anyone at all, because I don't. But I have been able to, again, by the skin of my teeth, derive purposefulness from it, which is valuable. So, no good day in prison. But I'm grateful for having pushed myself to make the best of an utterly hopeless situation.
That makes sense. And I suppose, you've come out the other end and you've got your podcast now, you've written books and things as well. And do you feel that if it wasn't for your family, you wouldn't have got there? Do you think it was that support network that really helped you get through?
Yeah, I do. Very honestly, I do. I would not be able to, do interviews or write articles or any of that today if I didn't have my family And that's a big lesson for anyone who's been incarcerated, rightly or wrongly. If you've been removed from society for so long, you need a support system when you get out if you have any hope of having a productive life. It's very, very difficult to reintegrate after all of that. And I, again, was very lucky to have support and to feel like I belonged in freedom. Never at any time did my family fail to remind me that I belonged out there with them. That's why they traveled so far to be with me. They never made me feel abandoned. And I think that's as much the reason why I am who I am today as, the whole bad part of it.
It's a great point that you make there, that your family constantly reminded you that you're entitled to this freedom, because I'd imagine that there's so many people that even when you're trying to get on with your daily life and that should be in the past for you now, it must be very hard to shake that tag for some people. They've read these newspaper reports, they've forged their own opinion, and for many that might not change.
Yeah, and again, that's for people who have been rightly and wrongly incarcerated. There's a lot of stigma attached to imprisonment. And it's very difficult to overcome that. There are hurdles that you have to leap over after you've been effectively crippled. So I really, really give props to those of us who raise ourselves up. And I deeply feel for those who can't, Yeah. So again, that's a lot of what the work that I do is just finding those people and finding those voices and writing about them and listening to them and valuing them. Because I think that it's a shame when human beings are thrown away. And there's a lot that can be learned from someone who has survived being thrown away.
In terms of your work just now, obviously you must deal with people that go through these situations on almost a daily basis, and it looks like you're really giving them a platform, through your podcast and through some of the TV shows that you've done as well to really get their story across there. Is there any specific ones that really jump out at you that think, that was similar to my situation, or I can completely resonate with what they're telling me here?
Absolutely. The first one that comes to mind is Jens Söring, who was a German exchange student in the US who was wrongly convicted back when he was 18 years old. I spent a whole season of the podcast on his case. And, I saw him as, a version of me that never got out. And of course, now he's out. Like, that's the amazing thing is like, there was no guarantee of him ever getting out. But after 33 years, he was allowed to go home to Germany just this past November. And he has been sending me weekly updates of the hikes that he's been going on and the food that he's been eating. And nothing can get him down. And that is a very, very joyous thing for me. But, it's not just wrongly convicted people, right? Like, I spent a whole 2 seasons of the Scarlet Letter reports devoting myself to stories of women who had been vilified for whatever reason. Because there are so many things that went wrong in my case that I see those same echoes in other people's stories. And I try to reach out to people to say, you're not alone. Some people are struggling and some people are not. Like, there's this girl named Daisy Coleman who was raped when she was 14 and, left out in her front yard like garbage. And she was slut shamed and vilified for coming forward. And I think that, there's this false dichotomy between victims of crime and victims of the criminal justice system, when in fact, crime victims and people like me have so much in common. A really good friend of mine is named Jennifer Thompson, and she has this wonderful, beautiful program called Healing Justice, where she brings victims of crime and victims of the criminal justice system together in a room to find healing and common ground together. It's a beautiful program. Another program that I've been looking into and I think is just wonderful is called the Frederick Douglass Project. And what it does is it invites people from the free world to come and just sit down and talk with incarcerated folks and to spend time together and find common ground and to be proximate to each other. I think that this sort of us versus them mentality has been deeply damaging. And this project, which I think is so cool, is attempting to give people access to the monsters and vice versa. And that's doing a tremendous amount of good because we talk about the media. Well, the media is this machine that works for us and it gives us what we want. And we have to tell it what we want. And if what we want is a compassionate, humanizing, truth-grounded information, we need to demand that of our media, not the sensational, splashy headline for the fun of it and the casual cruelty of it. Because it's so easy to judge and hate others. And it's a lot harder to pause and take the time to understand the facts and the context of every human being situation that you encounter. It's very difficult work, but it's worthwhile work, and I'm proud to do it. I'm very lucky that I get to do it. I've had incredible opportunities. There's this wonderful platform that I write for called Crime Story that is really focused on trying to give voice to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated population. It's amazing. Obviously, the truth about true crime. I'm talking with people, especially like like my last season of the podcast was all about this tremendously sensational case called the Preppy murder that happened back in New York in the 80s. And the victim of this crime was sensationalized and slut shamed, and it was totally unnecessary. And revisiting these cases and looking for echoes of them in our current events is incredibly useful, I think. It's okay that we were wrong about something and that we learned from it. I don't know, I'm kind of preaching now.
Do you ever feel like obviously you've shone a light on lots of wrongful convictions? Do you ever feel that people come to you with or they would say, I've been wrongly convicted, and you think, no, you've not? Has that ever came to you?
I don't, before I sort of put my foot down and say, you've been wrongly convicted, I'm obviously going to investigate that case. Yeah. But, I get lots of people, not just wrongfully convicted people, again, lots of people who reach out to me to say, hey, I'm being slut shamed, or hey, I'm being publicly shamed, or hey, I know someone who is struggling through something. Like, you'd be surprised the number of people who reach out to me, either seeking support or understanding. I think just understanding is a big part of it. People want to feel like they're not alone and they're not crazy for going through what they're going through. People who are being bullied. I get a lot of people reaching out to me about being bullied.
And I'd imagine you're quite open in taking this on board. It's like you would get back to everyone that gets in touch with you, because
I mean, I try. I'm also not the most technologically advanced, so sometimes I get lost on Instagram. I try.
Sure.
It's a lot of people, and I try to follow up as best I can. And but I'm not perfect, unfortunately.
And I'll go a bit more light touch then. I remember reading or watching an interview previously with yourself, and you were saying that when you were in prison, you got quite a lot of people writing to you, and there was some Irish people wrote to you and sent you some CDs. And was there ever any Scottish people got in touch with you?
I'm sure there was. I'm trying to think if I remember a specific. I mean, I definitely remember the Irish ones because clearly they sent me CDs, and there was this feeling of like, yeah, rebel against the authorities. They're wrong. Like that I really appreciated. I'm sure I received a letter from someone in Scotland. And if that person is listening right now, I love you, and I'm so sorry I don't remember. But I got letters from all over the world, and some of them were kind and some of them were cruel and some of them were curious. But most of them were sent as a letter of support to say, you aren't forgotten. And that's huge, because being in prison, one of the biggest things is you feel forgotten. You're literally taken from the world. And that was very, very encouraging. So I need to get up to Scotland.
Have you been before?
I've never been to Scotland, no. And I've been to Ireland once, and I loved it. Everyone was so kind to me. And so I've sort of have this expectation of a very like comfortable, open place. At least that's how I was treated when I was in Ireland.
Yeah, very similar, I would say. I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, it's just there's a warmth. I don't know, like there's this warmth that I
people
just
want to, and people want to speak to people, and if they don't recognize them, they're almost curious in a friendly way, I would say.
Yeah, I mean that's so charming. It's and not just charming. I mean, charming is kind of condescending. Like it's humanizing, right? It's like the human recognizing the human in the other and going, I see you. Like that's, it's not someone who's too busy to notice that you're another human being in the world. Like there's something very genuinely, self-realized about being someone who's willing to say, hey there, I see you. How you doing? So I appreciate that about all y'all.
And touching back on something that we spoke slightly about earlier was obviously you supported Donald Trump back in the day, and he was saying boycott Italy, and he very much had your back. Would you have his back now, or what's your thoughts on what's going on in the States?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that politics should work like that. I disagree with a lot of his policies, and I very openly disagree about them. One thing that I will hand it to him is he did pass the First Step Act, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's there's this big thing in the US where we had this sort of 3 strikes you're out law that started in California but sort of spread across the country, and also, in various forms became this federal law that said if you commit 3 crimes, like, sorry, you're out. You're going to be life imprisonment, no matter what that 3rd crime is. And the First Step Act was meant to pull that back and to rethink and re-examine some of the life sentences that have been imposed upon people federally, which means that, people who, especially people who are committing nonviolent crimes or crimes that would be considered misdemeanors today, are getting a second chance at life. And that's a big deal. And that is something that Trump's administration passed. It's something that had bipartisan support because, of course, it's common sense. And that's the spirit that our country is moving in a bipartisan way. But my goodness, am I worried about the environment, and am I worried about the social fabric of society? And I'm especially worried about how truth has been called into question. How, sort of politically and societally, what is considered true is no longer, people have less faith in facts anymore. And I think in large part that has resulted from this sort of political wins in the country, especially surrounding the Trump presidency. And that's very scary to me, because if we can't even agree on what facts are, then how in the world are we ever going to find common ground and, address policy? That's something I worry about a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there is something to be said about the whole fake news thing and Trump shutting down journalists before they can ask questions or speak. But I suppose for yourself, there must have been times where you were shouting at the newspapers fake news and whatever else. So it's almost full circle, isn't it?
It's interesting because, it's not like fake news isn't real, right? Like, again, media is a tool, and it can be a tool of information or misinformation. The problem is when people believe what they want to believe instead of what there is reason to believe. And I think Trump, like many human beings in the world, we all are guilty of this, believes what he wants to believe. And we all need to push ourselves, all of us, because we are all guilty of this, to believe what we have reason to believe. And I think that requires more work. But more work is worth it.
Totally. What's the future hold for yourself then? What's coming up next? What have you got planned?
Well, my husband and I are hard at work, so I'm going to give myself a shameless little plug and say,
you work together,
please,
is that correct?
well, just please follow me on Twitter at Amanda Knox, and on Instagram at Amama Knox. And you can follow all of my exploits that way. But again, I have a lot of things in the works. The things that you can find now are my written work for Crime Story. You can visit my podcast, The Truth About True Crime. Again, there's a whole new season that's in development right now, but I have 5 whole seasons leading up to that you can catch up on. The 4th one is my favorite. That's Vigilante Justice. And obviously the Scarlet Letter Reports. And yeah, that's what I've been up to. And my husband is a huge part of it. We work together. He is my everything. And he's my co-writer and my co-producer and my audio engineer.
Do you have to say that because he's going to listen back? Is that why you're giving him so much praise?
I mean, well, no, he's not even in the room. Actually, literally right now, he probably should be working, but he's working on his Dungeons and Dragons character. We're leveling up. We played over the weekend and we're leveling up this week. And he has a whole new spell set that he has to work out. So he's working out his spells for his wizard gnome character.
The excitement's building for the weekend already. I can feel it.
It's true. Actually, I'm excited because the SpaceX is supposed to be launching. So we should go check that out because it's been a while since we sent people up there.
Totally, Amanda. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.